As money continued to move further away from physical form, another quiet shift took place. Trust, which had once rested on metal and later on paper, began to rest increasingly on systems themselves. Not on what was held, but on how reliably value moved from one place to another. The question was no longer whether something existed somewhere, but whether the process surrounding it would continue to function. This was a subtle change, but a significant one. Earlier forms of money asked people to believe in substance. Later forms asked them to believe in promises. Now, belief began to center on continuity, on the expectation that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough for obligations to remain meaningful. Money became less about storage and more about flow. Value did not need to sit still. It needed to circulate, to arrive when expected, to move predictably through systems that most people would never see in full. Stability depended less on possession and more on coordination. This required a different kind of confidence. People no longer needed to know where value was kept. They needed to know how it behaved. They trusted patterns rather than objects, timing rather than weight, procedure rather than substance. This trust was built slowly. Systems demonstrated reliability through repetition. Payments arrived, records aligned, transfers completed without disruption. Each successful exchange reinforced the belief that the system worked, even if its inner workings remained obscure. Obscurity did not weaken trust. It often strengthened it. Understanding every detail was no longer necessary. Participation required only familiarity with outcomes. If effort consistently led to reward, belief followed naturally. Money became something people used rather than something they examined. This distance between use and understanding marked a new stage. Money had become infrastructure. Like roads or language, it was relied upon without being questioned daily. It shaped movement without demanding attention. Its presence was felt mainly through absence or failure. As long as systems functioned, they remained invisible. This invisibility allowed scale to increase further. Larger networks of exchange became possible because individual trust no longer needed to stretch across every connection. Systems absorbed uncertainty. They standardized interaction. They allowed people to cooperate across vast distances without direct knowledge of one another. But scale introduced fragility of a different kind. When trust rests on process rather than substance, disruption can spread quickly. Confidence depends on expectation. If expectation weakens, behavior changes. Not dramatically at first, but incrementally. People hesitate. They delay. They shorten commitments. These small shifts accumulate. Money reflects these changes immediately, not through announcement, but through movement. Circulation slows. Patterns tighten. Systems feel pressure not because value disappears, but because belief wavers. Belief once again proves central. Throughout history, moments of strain have revealed that money's strength lies less in what it represents and more in how people behave toward it. Systems survive when people continue to act as if continuity will hold. They strain when people begin to doubt that assumption. Doubt does not arrive suddenly. It begins as caution, as preference for immediacy, as reluctance to extend trust further than necessary. Money registers these behaviors before they are named. Institutions respond afterward. They adjust procedures, reinforce signals, clarify rules. These actions are meant to restore predictability rather than convince. Predictability reassures more effectively than explanation. People do not require certainty. They require consistency. Consistency allows planning. Planning allows cooperation. Cooperation sustains complexity. This chain remains unchanged, even as forms evolve. As money became increasingly process-based, responsibility also shifted. Individuals were no longer expected to verify value personally. Verification became institutional. Oversight replaced inspection. Assurance replaced visibility. This reduced effort for most participants. Life became easier to navigate. Exchange required fewer checks. Trust was embedded in structure. People could focus on their immediate roles rather than the system as a whole. But this ease came with dependency. When systems hold trust on behalf of individuals, individuals become reliant on those systems. Not consciously but practically, daily life begins to assume continuity as a given. Assumption becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. Expectation becomes dependence. This dependence is not weakness. It is the cost of coordination at scale. Large societies cannot function without shared reliance on systems beyond individual control. Money sits at the center of this reliance. It links effort to outcome across layers of abstraction. It allows people to act locally while participating globally. It makes coordination possible without requiring comprehension. Yet it also means that when systems strain, many feel it at once. The very feature that enables scale amplifies impact. This amplification is not accidental. It is inherent. Money does not isolate people from one another. It connects them. When connections tighten, shocks travel further. When they loosen, cooperation narrows. History moves between these states repeatedly. Periods of expansion follow periods of consolidation. Confidence widens, then contracts. Money adapts to these shifts, becoming more fluid or more restrained depending on behavior. It does not choose direction. It follows use. This responsiveness is why money persists across forms and eras. It is not rigid enough to shatter easily, nor fixed enough to resist change. It evolves by absorbing human behavior rather than correcting it. From trust in metal to trust in paper, to trust in promises, and now to trust in process, the evolution has been gradual and cumulative. Each step has asked people to accept more abstraction in exchange for convenience, reach, and continuity. Each acceptance has been provisional. Nothing has ever been final. Money continues to move forward in this way, shaped by how people live within systems they did not design, relying on patterns they may not fully understand, trusting just enough in continuity to act, plan, and cooperate. This trust is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is renewed daily through ordinary use. And as long as that renewal continues, money remains what it has always been. Not a solution to uncertainty, but a way of living with it. As this reliance on process deepened, money also began to change how people related to responsibility within systems they could not see. In earlier stages, responsibility was closer to the surface. A person could trace an exchange back to its source. If something failed, the cause often felt identifiable. With process-based money, responsibility became layered and indirect. Most people no longer interacted with the origin of value. They interacted with interfaces. A transaction completed. A balance updated. An obligation settled. What lay beneath these outcomes was assumed rather than examined. This assumption was necessary. No large system can function if every participant demands full visibility. Attention would fragment. Action would slow. Money reduced this friction by allowing people to trust outcomes without tracing causes. This trust reshaped accountability. When responsibility is embedded in process, failure feels systemic rather than personal. People sense disruption without knowing where it began. Blame becomes diffuse. Correction becomes procedural. This diffusion can feel unsettling. It removes the clarity that comes from direct cause and effect. Yet it also protects individuals from carrying burdens they cannot resolve. Systems absorb complexity so that daily life can remain manageable. Money plays a central role in this absorption. It translates countless individual actions into structured patterns. It allows institutions to respond to behavior in aggregate rather than case by case. This aggregation enables scale, but it also distances experience from explanation. Explanation becomes secondary. What matters most is whether things continue to work. When they do, reflection fades. When they do not, attention returns sharply. People do not ask how money works in stable times. They ask when stability wavers. These moments of questioning recur across history. They reveal that money's legitimacy does not come from understanding, but from reliability. People do not require transparency in normal times. They require continuity. Continuity reassures. It allows routines to persist. It allows planning to extend beyond the present. It allows people to invest effort without constant doubt. This reassurance is fragile but resilient. Fragile because it rests on expectation. Resilient because expectation is reinforced daily through use. As long as most exchanges succeed, belief holds. This belief is not ideological. It is practical. People continue to use money because it allows them to live their lives without excessive negotiation. It simplifies interaction. It reduces uncertainty at the level where most people operate. Money does not need to be trusted absolutely. It needs to be trusted enough. Enough to accept payment. Enough to defer reward. Enough to plan tomorrow. That threshold is lower than certainty, but higher than chaos. Money occupies that middle ground. As process-based systems matured, people grew accustomed to living with partial knowledge. They accepted that some things were handled elsewhere. This acceptance freed attention for immediate concerns. Freedom of attention is valuable. It allows focus. It allows creativity. It allows rest. Money, by handling coordination in the background, created space for other forms of life to unfold. Yet background systems influence foreground experience quietly. Rules shape possibility. Procedures shape pace. Timelines shape pressure. Money's structure influences how people feel about time, obligation, and effort, even when they are not thinking about money directly. This influence is subtle. It appears in how people measure progress, in how they pace work, in how they define completion. Money standardizes endings. An obligation ends when it is paid. A task ends when it is compensated. This closure is efficient, but it can feel abrupt. Human experience does not always end neatly. People learned to live with this mismatch. They accepted that systems require clean edges even when life does not provide them. Money supplied those edges. Over time, these edges shaped expectation. People began to seek closure through transaction. Completion became something that could be marked. This reduced ambiguity, but also reduced lingering acknowledgement. Again, societies adapted. They maintained spaces where closure remained open-ended, where gratitude, memory, and care extended beyond settlement. Money handled what needed to end. Culture handled what needed to continue. This division allowed balance. As long as money did not attempt to absorb everything, it remained workable. Its restraint preserved its role. Throughout its evolution, money has survived by knowing what it cannot do. It cannot create meaning. It cannot ensure justice. It cannot replace care. It can only coordinate. This humility is implicit rather than stated. Money does not claim authority over the whole of life. It occupies a specific function and leaves the rest untouched. When systems forget this limit, tension grows. Correction follows. Money retreats to its functional core. From barter to coins, from coins to paper, from paper to promises, and from promises to process, this pattern repeats. Expansion, strain, adjustment. Each cycle refines the system without resolving it completely. Money remains unfinished because human cooperation remains unfinished. Needs evolve. Scales change. Trust shifts. Money follows these movements patiently. It does not rush toward an end state. It remains adaptable. As long as people continue to rely on systems they cannot fully see, to coordinate with others they may never meet, and to act without complete knowledge of consequences, money in some form will remain present. Not as an object to admire, not as a force to fear, but as a quiet structure that allows life to proceed, absorbing complexity, distributing responsibility, and making large-scale cooperation possible without demanding constant understanding. And so episode 3 continues in this space, where trust rests on process, where belief is renewed through use, and where money, once again, shifts its weight not by design, but by adaptation, moving forward slowly alongside the people who depend on it without fully noticing that they do. As this quiet dependence on process became routine, money also began to influence how people experienced control. In earlier forms of exchange, control felt personal. You decided when to trade, what to give, and what to accept. The limits were visible. Choice was constrained, but it was direct. Action and consequence were closely linked. With large, process-based systems, control became indirect. People still made decisions, but outcomes were shaped by layers beyond immediate reach. Timing, approval, and completion depended on systems operating elsewhere. Control shifted from direct action to participation within structure. This shift was not imposed. It was accepted. People learned that direct control did not scale well. Large coordination required surrendering some immediacy in exchange for reliability. Money embodied this trade. It reduced personal control while increasing collective function. This trade altered emotional experience. Frustration became more common, but also more diffuse. Delays were tolerated as part of process. Outcomes were expected to arrive eventually rather than immediately. Patience became procedural rather than personal. People adjusted their expectations accordingly. They learned to work within timelines rather than moments, to submit requests rather than negotiate outcomes, to wait for confirmation rather than demand response. Money normalized this waiting by embedding delay into exchange. Delay did not always feel fair, but it felt predictable. Predictability softened resistance. People could accept limits when they were consistent. Money systems prioritized consistency over responsiveness. This priority allowed them to function across scale. Responsiveness remained, but it slowed. Slow response reduced volatility. It also reduced agency felt at the individual level. People learned to separate what they could influence from what they could not. This separation protected mental energy. Without it, frustration would be constant. Money systems helped establish boundaries around expectation. They defined where effort ended and where system began. These boundaries were essential. They allowed people to focus on what lay within reach. Their role, their contribution, their obligation. The rest was handled elsewhere. This handling created trust not in control, but in continuity. People did not need to control outcomes. They needed to believe that outcomes would arrive within acceptable bounds. Money reinforced this belief through repeated fulfillment. When fulfillment failed, attention sharpened. People questioned procedures. They sought clarity. They demanded reassurance. Systems responded with explanation, reform, or reinforcement. These responses were aimed at restoring predictability rather than expanding control. Control remained limited. This limitation became normal. People accepted that participation did not grant mastery. They learned to operate within systems larger than themselves. Money facilitated this acceptance by making interaction manageable without granting authority. Authority remained centralized. Coordination required it. This centralization reduced chaos but increased distance. People rarely saw where decisions were made. They experienced results rather than process. Money carried those results forward impersonally. Impersonality reduced conflict. Disagreements shifted away from individuals toward systems. People argued with rules rather than people. This reduced personal strain, even as it sometimes deepened dissatisfaction. Money supported this shift by providing clear reference points. Amounts, dates, records. These elements framed disputes within structure rather than emotion. Structure absorbed tension. Absorption allowed systems to persist. Over time, people internalized this arrangement. They adjusted ambition to procedure. They aligned effort with expectation. They learned where resistance was futile and where adaptation was wiser. This learning was not passive. It was shaped by experience, by friction, by success and failure. Money reflected these experiences by adjusting patterns of use. When people felt constrained, participation narrowed. When they felt supported, participation widened. Money mirrored these movements without commentary. This mirroring is often mistaken for control. In reality, money follows behavior more than it directs it. It records choices rather than commanding them. It amplifies patterns rather than inventing them. Understanding this distinction clarifies its role. Money does not decide how much control people have. It operates within limits set by social tolerance, institutional design, and collective behavior. When those limits change, money adapts. This adaptability explains its survival. Rigid systems break. Flexible systems endure. Money endures by remaining flexible in form while stable in function. Its function remains coordination. Coordination requires compromise. People trade immediacy for reliability, control for predictability, visibility for scale. Money makes these trades workable. They are never complete. Some desire for control always remains. Some frustration always persists. Money does not eliminate these feelings. It channels them into manageable patterns. As long as people continue to live within systems they do not fully control, they will seek structures that allow participation without mastery. Money remains one such structure. It allows action without command, participation without oversight, contribution without authorship. These allowances shape modern cooperation, even though they feel ordinary. Ordinary systems are powerful. They shape behavior without announcement. They persist without praise. They adapt without declaration. Money continues in this way, embedded in routine, shaping how people experience control, responsibility, and limitation, moving forward quietly alongside human life, adjusting slowly as tolerance shifts, and remaining present not because it grants power, but because it makes participation possible in a world too complex for direct control alone. As this indirect sense of control became familiar, money also began to influence how people understood participation itself. In earlier exchange, participation was unmistakable. If you traded, you were present. If you contributed, your role was visible. Inclusion and exclusion were clear because they depended on proximity and recognition. With system-based money, participation became quieter. A person could take part without being seen. Their effort could enter a system and move onward without carrying their identity with it. Contribution no longer required presence. It required compliance with process. This quiet participation allowed systems to grow larger. Millions could contribute without knowing one another. Coordination did not depend on awareness, only on alignment. Money provided the interface through which this alignment occurred. Yet participation without visibility changed perception. People began to feel both included and distant at the same time. They were part of something larger, yet rarely able to see its full shape. Their role felt real but abstract. This abstraction altered motivation. In smaller settings, motivation came from recognition and shared outcome. In large systems, motivation shifted toward completion. A task was done when obligation was met. Payment marked the boundary. Beyond that boundary, attention moved elsewhere. Money reinforced this boundary. It defined where participation ended. Once settled, involvement dissolved. This allowed people to move through many systems without being consumed by any single one. This freedom was necessary. No individual could remain emotionally engaged with every structure they participated in. Money allowed detachment where intimacy was unnecessary. It preserved capacity for engagement where it mattered most. Yet detachment also reduced awareness. People felt less connected to the consequences of distant actions. Outcomes unfolded beyond sight. Responsibility felt diffuse. Participation continued without reflection. Societies learned to live with this tension. They accepted that large-scale cooperation required some loss of visibility. They relied on institutions to manage what individuals could not track. Money acted as the medium through which this management occurred. This reliance deepened trust in process, not because people admired it, but because they depended on it. Dependence does not require affection. It requires reliability. Money systems survived by prioritizing reliability above all else. Reliability creates rhythm. Payments arrive on schedule. Obligations recur predictably. Cycles repeat. This rhythm structures life quietly. People align effort with expectation. They plan around intervals rather than events. Time becomes procedural. Earlier, time was marked by change. With money, time became marked by repetition. Weeks, months, and cycles gained meaning through obligation. Money did not invent calendars, but it gave them practical weight. This procedural time reduced uncertainty. People knew when something was due. They knew when something would arrive. Even if the future remained unknown, parts of it were structured. This structure reduced anxiety. Money provided that structure, not by explaining the future, but by dividing it into manageable segments. People lived from obligation to obligation, outcome to outcome, trusting that continuity would hold between them. Trust here was not emotional. It was functional. People trusted systems the way they trusted bridges, not because they understood their design, but because they crossed them daily without collapse. Use reinforced belief. Belief reinforced use. This cycle strengthened participation even as understanding thinned. People did not need to know how everything worked. They needed only to know how to engage. Money standardized engagement. It told people what to do, when to do it, and how completion would be recognized. This clarity reduced friction. It also narrowed imagination. When participation is standardized, deviation feels risky. People align behavior with expectation. Innovation moves slowly. Change emerges through accumulation rather than rupture. Money reflects this conservatism. It favors continuity. It resists abrupt shifts. It adapts incrementally. This conservatism protects systems from instability, but it also delays response to new conditions. Delay is tolerated because stability is valued. Most people prefer predictable imperfection to unpredictable change. Money systems embody this preference. They adjust cautiously, preserving familiar patterns as long as possible. This preference explains why money often appears slow to respond. In reality, it responds constantly, but in small ways. Through altered use, through changed participation, through subtle shifts in behavior that precede formal change. Formal change follows behavior. Institutions codify what people have already begun to do. Money systems then reflect these codifications. This order keeps disruption manageable. Participation continues. This continuation is essential. Large societies cannot pause entirely to reconsider foundations. Life must go on. Money allows reconsideration to happen gradually, without halting exchange. It absorbs questioning into practice. People do not stop using money to question it. They adjust how they use it. Money records these adjustments over time. This recording is not intentional. It is emergent. Patterns form without design. Stability returns without declaration. Money evolves without announcement. As participation becomes increasingly mediated, people grow accustomed to acting within structures they do not shape directly. They accept limits on control and visibility in exchange for reliability and inclusion. Inclusion without intimacy. Participation without authorship. Contribution without recognition. These conditions define modern cooperation. Money did not create them alone. It made them workable. And so episode 3 continues within this space, where participation is quiet, trust is procedural, and coordination extends far beyond individual awareness. Money remains the medium that allows this to happen, not as a guiding force, but as a responsive structure, moving with behavior, adjusting slowly, and enabling people to live within systems far larger than themselves, while still feeling, most of the time, that life remains manageable. The movement goes on, shaped not by grand intention, but by ordinary participation repeated day after day, sustaining cooperation through habit, rhythm, and the quiet expectation that tomorrow will arrive much like today. As this quiet form of participation settled into everyday life, money also began to influence how people understood visibility. In earlier forms of exchange, visibility was natural. You saw who traded with whom. You knew where goods came from and where they went. Exchange left traces in daily life. Visibility reinforced awareness. With large process-based systems, visibility diminished. Most exchange happened beyond sight. Records moved silently. Obligations were fulfilled without witness. Value appeared and disappeared without narrative. Participation continued, but observation did not. This loss of visibility was not accidental. It was necessary for scale. A system that required everyone to see everything would collapse under its own weight. Money allowed exchange to occur without requiring constant observation. People adapted to this absence. They learned to trust outcomes rather than processes. They accepted that most activity would remain unseen. What mattered was whether results arrived when expected. Expectation replaced observation. This replacement shaped emotional life quietly. People stopped watching systems closely. They focused on personal routines. Money operated in the background, like infrastructure, only noticed when disrupted. This background presence reduced mental strain. No one could track the full movement of value in a complex society. Money allowed people to participate without carrying that burden. It simplified reality by hiding what did not need to be seen. Yet hidden systems create distance. When consequences are not visible, awareness weakens. People may act without sensing the broader impact. Responsibility feels abstract. Participation feels light. Societies learned to live with this trade. They accepted reduced visibility in exchange for coordination. They relied on institutions to monitor what individuals could not. Money became the language through which this monitoring occurred. Monitoring itself became procedural. Reports, records, and summaries replaced stories. Patterns mattered more than examples. Aggregates mattered more than individuals. Money translated countless small actions into signals that institutions could read. This translation allowed governance. It allowed adjustment without direct intervention. It allowed systems to respond to trends rather than incidents. This responsiveness increased stability, but also widened the gap between experience and explanation. People felt effects before they understood causes. This delay was normal. Understanding always lagged behind experience. Money reflected experience immediately through behavior. Understanding followed later, often imperfectly. This imperfection did not stop use. People continued to rely on money because it worked often enough. Reliability mattered more than clarity. Money did not need to explain itself. It needed to function. Function sustained trust. Trust sustained participation. Participation sustained complexity. This chain repeated. As visibility declined, symbols gained importance. Numbers, statements, and confirmations became substitutes for observation. They reassured people that systems were operating as expected. Reassurance did not require detail. It required consistency. When symbols aligned with expectation, confidence held. When they did not, attention returned sharply. People questioned what lay beneath the surface. These moments of questioning were periodic. They did not destroy systems. They refined them. Adjustments followed. Transparency increased temporarily. Procedures were clarified. Confidence returned. Then visibility faded again. This cycle allowed money to remain both opaque and acceptable. It revealed just enough to sustain trust, then retreated. This balance was learned. Too much opacity eroded confidence. Too much visibility overwhelmed participation. Money systems evolved to occupy the middle ground. This middle ground changed over time. As societies grew more complex, tolerance for opacity increased. People accepted that understanding everything was impossible. They focused on what affected them directly. Money supported this focus. It reduced the need to understand beyond immediate interaction. It allowed people to engage locally within global systems without carrying global awareness. This localization of attention was essential. Without it, life would feel unmanageable. Money allowed people to live within complexity without being crushed by it. Yet complexity still shaped experience indirectly. Decisions made elsewhere affected outcomes here. People sensed connection without seeing it. This sensing produced unease at times, curiosity at others. Money mediated this unease by providing predictability at the interface. Even if causes were distant, effects followed familiar patterns. Familiarity reassured. People learned to accept partial understanding as normal. They trusted patterns more than explanations. Money became one of those patterns. It did not explain the world. It stabilized interaction within it. As visibility declined, participation became increasingly routine. Exchange felt automatic. Obligation felt scheduled. Completion felt procedural. This routinization freed attention. People could devote energy to personal concerns rather than systemic awareness. Money handled coordination quietly. Quiet systems endure. They do not demand loyalty. They do not ask for admiration. They function, and in functioning, they are accepted. Money achieved this status over long periods of adjustment. From visible barter to abstract process, each step reduced the need for observation. Each step increased reliance on trust. Each step made participation easier and understanding thinner. People accepted these changes because they allowed life to continue with less friction. Friction draws attention. Ease allows forgetting. Forgetting is not failure. It is how complex systems remain livable. Money enables this forgetting by working in the background, absorbing complexity, and presenting only what is necessary for action. As long as it continues to do so, people will continue to participate without needing to see the whole. And so the movement continues quietly, shaped by how much visibility people need, how much opacity they tolerate, and how systems adjust to maintain that balance. Money remains at the center of this adjustment, not as something to be seen clearly, but as something that allows life to proceed without requiring constant sight, explanation, or understanding. As this balance between visibility and opacity became familiar, money also began to shape how people understood continuity of identity within systems. In earlier exchange, identity and action were closely linked. You were known by what you did and by whom you dealt with. Exchange reinforced identity because it was personal. Your reputation traveled with you. As money became more abstract, identity receded from exchange. A transaction no longer required knowing who someone was beyond what the system recognized. Names, faces, and histories mattered less than validity. Participation depended on compliance with structure rather than personal standing. This separation altered experience quietly. People learned that they could act without being known. They could contribute without being recognized. Identity became something carried elsewhere, outside of transaction. This allowed privacy. Privacy reduced exposure. It protected individuals from judgment in routine exchange. Money made it possible to participate without narrating oneself. This relief mattered in large societies where constant recognition would be exhausting. Yet identity does not disappear when it is not required. It shifts location. People invested identity in roles outside of exchange. In family, in belief, in craft, in personal story. Money handled coordination. Identity lived elsewhere. This division stabilized behavior. When exchange does not threaten identity, participation becomes easier. People do not need to defend who they are in order to act. Money allows interaction to remain neutral. Neutrality supports scale. Large systems cannot carry personal meaning for everyone. They require abstraction. Money provided that abstraction by reducing interaction to function. Function replaced narrative. This replacement did not erase meaning. It displaced it. Meaning continued in spaces not governed by exchange. Societies learned to protect these spaces because they were essential. Money respected these boundaries when they were reinforced by use. When exchange attempted to absorb identity, resistance followed. People reclaimed meaning through custom, language, and separation. Money retreated to its functional role. This retreat preserved trust. Money remained acceptable because it did not claim authority over who people were. It coordinated what they did together, not who they were individually. As identity became layered, people navigated multiple roles simultaneously. Participant in systems, member of communities, bearer of personal history. Money moved across these layers without preference. This indifference was not coldness. It was necessity. No system of exchange can carry the full weight of identity without collapsing. Money survived by refusing that burden. Over time, this refusal shaped expectation. People stopped looking to money for recognition. They expected it to provide closure, not acknowledgement. Completion, not mining. This clarity reduced disappointment. Money did not promise dignity. It promised settlement. When it delivered settlement reliably, it was trusted. When people sought dignity elsewhere, social life remained balanced. This balance was learned through experience. Periods of strain revealed when boundaries blurred. Correction followed. Systems adjusted. Money returned to its limited role. Through all these adjustments, money continued to evolve as a medium of coordination rather than expression. It carried value without story. It carried obligation without emotion. It carried effort without identity. These limitations allowed it to function where other forms of connection could not. They also required supplementation. Human life filled the gaps money left open. Through relationship, through ritual, through memory, through care, these elements gave life texture beyond transaction. Money did not replace them. It made room for them by handling what could be standardized. This division remains essential. As long as people live within large systems, they will need ways to act together without merging identities. Money provides that possibility. It allows people to remain themselves while participating in structures larger than any one person. This quiet allowance is part of its endurance. From early barter, where identity was inseparable from exchange, to abstract systems where exchange operates independently of personhood, the shift has been gradual. Each step reduced exposure. Each step increased scale. Each step required acceptance of distance. People accepted these changes not because they desired abstraction, but because life at scale demanded it. Money followed that demand patiently. It adapted form without altering function. It moved with human behavior rather than ahead of it. It became quieter as societies grew louder. And so the movement continues, shaped by how people protect identity while participating in systems that cannot know them fully. Money remains present in this negotiation, coordinating action without defining self, enabling cooperation without demanding recognition, and continuing its long role as a structure that allows many lives to move together without losing their separateness. The story carries on, unhurried, sustained by routine, shaped by adjustment, and grounded in the enduring need to act together while remaining, in essential ways unknown to the systems that make that action possible. As this separation between identity and exchange became settled, money also began to shape how people understood memory. In early exchange, memory was central. Who owed what, who had helped whom, and who could be trusted were all carried in personal recollection. Memory lived in people. It faded, but it also adapted. Forgetting and forgiveness were part of the same process. With money and record-based systems, memory moved outward. Obligations no longer relied on human recall. They were written, counted, and stored. Memory became mechanical. A ledger remembered what people did not need to. This reduced conflict and confusion. It also changed how people related to the past. The past became fixed. A recorded obligation did not soften with time. A number did not forget context. What had been written remained as it was, even when circumstances changed. Money made memory durable, but less flexible. This durability supported scale. Large systems could not rely on personal memory. They required consistency. Records provided that. Money gave those records meaning by linking them to obligation and settlement. People adapted to this rigidity. They learned that some things would not fade naturally. Closure required action. Payment erased obligation. Without settlement, memory persisted. This persistence altered behavior. People became more attentive to endings. They sought completion rather than resolution. A matter was finished when the record was cleared, not when understanding was reached. Money reinforced this approach. It defined when the past could be left behind. It marked boundaries between before and after. This clarity reduced lingering conflict, even as it sometimes left emotion unresolved. Societies accepted this trade. They allowed systems to handle memory while culture handled meaning. Rituals, storytelling, and personal acknowledgement continued alongside records. Money did not replace remembrance. It narrowed its own role. As records accumulated, history began to shape the present more directly. Old agreements constrained new choices. Past decisions limited future options. Continuity became structural rather than narrative. Money carried these constraints forward impersonally. This impersonality felt fair to some and harsh to others. Rules applied equally, but not always kindly. Money did not interpret history. It preserved it. Interpretation remained human work. Over time, people learned to navigate between recorded past and lived experience. They accepted that systems remembered differently than people did. They adjusted expectations accordingly. This adjustment reduced frustration. When people stopped expecting systems to forgive or forget, they sought those qualities elsewhere. Human relationships provided flexibility. Systems provided consistency. Money occupied the consistent side. Consistency allowed predictability. Predictability allowed planning. Planning allowed coordination. The chain remained intact, yet consistency also accumulated weight. Old structures became harder to change. Memory embedded in records resisted revision. Societies responded by creating formal mechanisms for change. Laws could be amended, debts restructured, records updated. These processes were slow by design. Speed threatened trust. Slowness preserved continuity. Money systems favored stability over responsiveness. This preference shaped how people experienced time. The past lingered longer. The future unfolded gradually. Change felt deliberate rather than sudden. Money encouraged patience by making abrupt shifts costly. Patience became procedural. People waited not because they wished to, but because systems required it. Money normalized this waiting by embedding time into obligation. As memory moved outward, personal recollection lost some of its practical role. People no longer needed to remember every exchange. They relied on records. This freed mental space. It also reduced narrative richness. Stories faded where numbers remained. Societies compensated through culture. They preserved memory through shared accounts rather than through obligation. History became something to learn rather than something to settle. Money handled settlement. Story handled remembrance. This division allowed both to coexist. Money did not need to remember why. It needed only to remember what. Human memory supplied the rest. As long as this balance held, systems remained workable. When it strained, people reacted. They sought context. They demanded reconsideration. They questioned rigidity. Systems responded cautiously, adjusting rules while preserving structure. Money adapted by incorporating change slowly. It absorbed new understandings without erasing old ones entirely. It layered adjustment over continuity. This layering became characteristic. Old memories remained beneath new arrangements. The system carried traces of its past even as it moved forward. Money embodied this accumulation. From early barter, where memory lived in people, to modern systems where memory lives in structure, the shift was gradual. Each step reduced reliance on personal recall. Each step increased dependence on record. Each step traded flexibility for scale. People accepted these trades because they made large cooperation possible. Money remains part of this acceptance. It carries memory forward without emotion, without context, and without intent. It does not judge the past. It preserves it. What people do with that preservation remains a human choice. And so the movement continues, shaped by how societies balance remembrance and release, structure and story, record and meaning. Money remains the medium that remembers reliably so that people do not have to, allowing life to continue without being bound entirely by what came before, even as the past quietly shapes the present through systems that remember long after individuals have moved on. As this shift of memory from people to systems became familiar, money also began to shape how people experienced forgetting. In earlier life, forgetting was natural. Time softened obligations. Distance reduced intensity. What was not reinforced gradually faded. Forgetting allowed relationships to heal and life to move forward without constant accounting. With recorded money, forgetting became harder. Systems remembered even when people wished to forget. A record did not tire. It did not forgive. It did not reinterpret events as circumstances changed. What had been written remained present until it was formally resolved. This persistence changed emotional life quietly. People learned that some things would not disappear on their own. Closure required action rather than time. Settlement replaced forgiveness. Payment replaced release. Money made forgetting procedural. An obligation ended not when memory faded, but when the record was cleared. This clarity reduced ambiguity. It also reduced gentleness. Life became more precise, but sometimes less forgiving. Societies adapted. They learned to distinguish between what systems should remember and what people should release. Money handled formal obligation. Human relationships handled emotional memory. Each had its place. This separation allowed balance. Without it, rigidity would dominate. With it, structure and compassion could coexist. Money did not prevent forgetting. It required it to happen elsewhere. As systems grew more complex, the cost of forgetting incorrectly increased. A forgotten record could cause harm. An overlooked obligation could ripple outward. Precision became important. Accuracy gained moral weight. Care in record-keeping became a form of responsibility. This responsibility shifted labor. More effort went into maintaining memory externally so that people could forget internally. Systems carried detail so individuals did not have to. This trade reduced mental load, even as it increased institutional burden. People grew accustomed to this arrangement. They trusted that systems would remember on their behalf. They focused attention on present concerns. Money allowed life to proceed without constant reference to the past. Yet the past remained active. It shaped options, constrained choices, and influenced outcomes even when it was not consciously recalled. Money carried these influences forward silently. Silence is powerful. When causes are not visible, effects feel inevitable. People experience outcomes without narrative. This can produce resignation or acceptance, depending on context. Societies responded by telling stories. History, education, and reflection reintroduced narrative where systems offered only structure. These stories did not alter records. They provided meaning alongside them. Money did not compete with story. It coexisted. It allowed structure to persist without explanation. Story allowed explanation without altering structure. Together, they made continuity tolerable. Over time, people learned to live within this duality. They accepted that some things would be remembered by systems and others by people. They adjusted expectation accordingly. Frustration softened when boundaries were understood. This understanding was experiential. People learned through friction, through moments when forgetting was impossible and moments when memory was unnecessary. Money shaped these moments by defining where formality ended and informality began. These boundaries were not fixed. They shifted with culture, scale, and tolerance. Money adapted by changing scope rather than nature. It remembered more or less, depending on what societies required. Throughout its evolution, money has been closely tied to how societies manage memory and forgetting. Too much memory freezes action. Too much forgetting dissolves trust. Money sits between these extremes. It preserves what must endure and allows the rest to fade elsewhere. This balance is not perfect, but it is workable. Workable is enough. From barter, where memory lived entirely in people, to coins and paper, where memory became shared, to records and processes, where memory became structural, the movement has been consistent. People seek ways to move forward without carrying everything behind them. Money provides one such way. It does not relieve people of responsibility. It organizes responsibility so that life can continue. It allows forgetting where forgetting is healthy and remembrance where remembrance is necessary. This quiet role is rarely noticed. Money is discussed in terms of value and exchange, but its deeper function lies in how it manages time. What is carried forward? What is settled? What is allowed to pass? As long as people live within time, as long as the past must be honored without dominating the present, and as long as the future requires preparation without certainty, money will continue to play this role. Not loudly, not decisively, but patiently, embedded in routine, shaping how societies remember and forget just enough to keep moving forward. As this balance between memory and forgetting settled into practice, money also began to shape how people understood renewal. In early life, renewal was physical and visible. Tools wore out and were repaired. Fields rested and were replanted. Effort returned in cycles that could be seen and felt. Renewal depended on rest, repetition, and care. Money introduced a different rhythm. Value could be renewed without repairing the original thing. An obligation settled could immediately be replaced by another. Exchange did not require rest in the same way that bodies and land did. Continuity could be maintained through flow rather than pause. This altered how people experienced cycles. Earlier, cycles were enforced by limitation. With money, cycles became optional. Activity could continue as long as coordination held. Renewal was no longer automatic. It required intention. This change was gradual. At first, money followed natural rhythms. Markets closed. Exchange slowed with seasons. Over time, as systems grew more reliable, activity detached from natural constraint. Renewal became something to manage rather than something that arrived on its own. People adapted to this shift. They learned to schedule rest instead of waiting for it. They planned pauses rather than relying on exhaustion to enforce them. Money made continuous activity possible, but it did not remove the need for renewal. This distinction mattered. Without renewal, systems strain. Without pause, patterns become brittle. Societies learned this through experience rather than design. Periods of intensity were followed by periods of correction. Money reflected these movements. When activity accelerated, exchange intensified. When strain appeared, behavior slowed. Money did not impose renewal. It responded to it. This responsiveness made renewal uneven. Some parts of society paused while others continued. Some rhythms overlapped. Coordination required constant adjustment. Money carried these adjustments forward quietly. Over long spans, people became skilled at sensing when renewal was needed, not through calculation, but through feeling. Fatigue, hesitation, reduced engagement. These signals appeared in behavior before they were named. Money registered them through patterns of use. Institutions responded later. They adjusted schedules, revised expectations, formalized pauses. These changes were often framed as efficiency, but they served renewal. Money adapted to these changes by accommodating new rhythms. It did not define when to stop. It reflected when people did. This reflection preserved flexibility. Rigid cycles would have failed under changing conditions. Flexible rhythms allowed systems to endure. Money survived by remaining sensitive to use rather than enforcing tempo. Renewal also applied to trust. Trust could not be assumed indefinitely. It required reinforcement. Periods of smooth exchange renewed confidence. Periods of strain depleted it. Money carried these fluctuations forward. Confidence rebuilt through repetition. One successful exchange followed another. Patterns stabilized. Trust returned quietly. No announcement was needed. Use itself was the signal. This quiet rebuilding is often overlooked. Attention tends to focus on disruption. Renewal happens slowly and without spectacle. Money participates in this quiet work by continuing to function during recovery. It does not demand certainty before use resumes. It allows tentative participation. Small exchanges rebuild confidence incrementally. This incremental renewal supports continuity. Large systems cannot be restarted all at once. They resume through countless small actions. Money enables this by allowing partial engagement without full commitment. People test. They observe. They adjust. Money accommodates this testing. Over time, renewal becomes part of routine. Systems expect fluctuation. They plan for adjustment. They incorporate buffers. Money reflects this maturity by absorbing variation without collapse. This absorption does not eliminate difficulty. It moderates it. From barter, where renewal was enforced by nature, to coins, where renewal followed supply, to records and processes, where renewal depended on behavior, the shift has been consistent. People move from enforced cycles to managed ones. Money enables management, but it does not guarantee wisdom. Wisdom remains human. People must decide when to pause, when to continue, when to repair, and when to let go. Money provides signals, not answers. These signals are subtle. They appear in participation, in willingness, in rhythm. Those who pay attention adjust early. Those who do not feel adjustment later. Money records both. It does not favor foresight or delay. It carries forward what people do. This neutrality is why money can support renewal without directing it. It remains a medium through which cycles express themselves rather than a mechanism that controls them. As long as people continue to live within time, to tire and recover, to accelerate and pause, money will continue to adapt to these rhythms. It will not replace renewal. It will coexist with it, quietly, allowing continuity to resume after strain, allowing trust to rebuild after doubt, allowing systems to recover without requiring perfect alignment. And so the movement continues, shaped by how people manage their own limits, reflected through exchange, and carried forward by a system that responds to human rhythm rather than dictating it, enabling life to proceed not without interruption, but with the capacity to begin again. As this capacity for renewal became part of ordinary life, money also began to shape how people understood limits. In early exchange, limits were immediate and physical. You could only trade what you had. You could only give what you could carry. Scarcity was visible. Exhaustion enforced restraint. With abstract money, limits became less obvious. Value could be represented without being present. Obligations could be created faster than effort could replenish. Exchange no longer stopped automatically when bodies tired or resources paused. Limits still existed, but they were no longer felt directly. This distance changed behavior. People learned to operate closer to boundaries without sensing them clearly. Activity continued until something signaled strain. That signal was rarely physical at first. It appeared as hesitation, delay, or tightening of participation. Money reflected these signals. It did not announce that limits had been reached. It showed it through patterns. Slower movement, shorter commitments, reduced willingness to extend trust. These changes were subtle. Often they were noticed only in hindsight. At the time, they felt like caution rather than constraint. People adjusted behavior without naming the reason. This adjustment was adaptive. It allowed systems to slow before breaking. It introduced restraint without requiring full awareness of cause. Money carried this restraint forward through changed use. As limits became abstract, responsibility for managing them shifted. Individuals no longer felt limits directly. Institutions monitored aggregates. Patterns replaced sensation. Oversight replaced intuition. This shift required trust. People trusted that someone, somewhere, was watching boundaries they could no longer see. Money enabled this trust by translating countless actions into signals that could be observed at scale. Yet trust in oversight was never complete. People retained instinctive caution. They tested boundaries indirectly. They waited. They watched. Money reflected this watching by registering hesitation as behavior. When confidence returned, participation expanded again. This expansion and contraction formed a rhythm, not enforced by rule, but guided by collective sensing. Money became the medium through which this sensing expressed itself. Limits were no longer walls. They were gradients, approached slowly, felt unevenly, crossed sometimes without awareness. This made correction more complex. When limits are visible, correction is direct. When they are abstract, correction is delayed. Systems respond after pressure has accumulated. Adjustment follows experience rather than foresight. Money participates in this delay. It does not warn. It records. It shows what has already happened. This backward-looking nature is not a flaw. It is a reflection of how human systems learn. Learning follows action. Action precedes understanding. Money carries the record of that sequence. Over long periods, societies learned to build buffers around limits they could not see. Reserves, margins, redundancies. These were attempts to restore distance from boundaries that abstraction had compressed. Money enabled these buffers by making them measurable and transferable. Yet buffers, too, could fade from awareness. When systems function smoothly, margins feel unnecessary. People move closer to limits again. Confidence expands. Caution recedes. The cycle repeats. Money does not prevent this cycle. It reflects it faithfully. This faithfulness is part of its endurance. Money does not moralize limits. It does not enforce restraint. It allows behavior to express itself until adjustment becomes necessary. Necessity is the teacher. Through repeated cycles, societies became more skilled at recognizing early signals. They learned to read patterns. They learned when slowing was wiser than pressing forward. This learning was uneven. Some paid attention. Others did not. Money carried both responses forward without preference. Outcomes diverged. Experience accumulated. Money preserved that experience structurally, not as wisdom but as constraint. Rules, norms, and practices emerged from past encounters with limits. These constraints shaped future behavior quietly. People inherited them without knowing their origin. This inheritance stabilized systems. Limits that were once discovered painfully became embedded into routine. Money reflected these routines through accepted ranges, expectations, and norms of exchange. Yet no set of constraints remained final. Conditions changed. Scale increased. New forms of abstraction emerged. Old limits reappeared in new forms. Money adjusted again. From barter where limits were immediate to coins, where limits followed supply, to records and processes, where limits followed behavior, the progression has been consistent. Limits move further from sensation and closer to structure. Money adapts by becoming a language for managing what cannot be directly felt. It does not remove limits. It relocates them. This relocation allows expansion, but it requires attention. When attention fades, pressure builds. When pressure builds, correction follows. This pattern repeats across time. Money remains central to this pattern because it is where behavior becomes visible again. It is where abstract limits re-enter experience through changed use. People may not see the boundary, but they feel its approach through friction. That friction slows action. Slowing allows renewal. Renewal restores distance. Distance allows movement to resume. Money carries this entire sequence forward quietly, without instruction, without warning, and without judgment. As long as people continue to push against limits they cannot fully see, money will continue to serve as the medium through which those limits are encountered, adjusted to, and carried into the future. Not as a guide, not as a guardian, but as a responsive structure that records human behavior as it unfolds, allowing societies to move, pause, and move again within boundaries that are discovered not by design, but by living. As these abstract limits became part of lived experience, money also began to shape how people understood balance. In early life, balance was physical. You felt when effort exceeded strength. You saw when resources thinned. Balance was enforced by the body and the land. When imbalance appeared, correction was immediate. With money-based systems, balance became less tangible. Imbalance could grow quietly. Activity could continue without obvious strain. Effort could be extended beyond comfort. Exchange could expand beyond replenishment. Balance still mattered, but it was no longer felt directly. Instead, balance appeared through patterns. Participation increased or slowed. Commitments lengthened or shortened. Confidence widened or narrowed. Money reflected these movements not as warnings, but as shifts in behavior. People learned to read these shifts intuitively. Not everyone could explain them, but many sensed them. Something felt stretched. Something felt tight. Decisions adjusted slightly in response. Money carried those adjustments forward. This sensing was collective rather than individual. No single person held the whole picture. Balance emerged from many small decisions interacting. Money aggregated these decisions into visible outcomes. Aggregation changed responsibility. Balance was no longer something one person maintained. It was something systems held collectively. Oversight replaced instinct. Indicators replaced sensation. This replacement was imperfect. Indicators lagged. They simplified. They could not capture everything that mattered, but they were enough to guide adjustment most of the time. Most of the time is sufficient. Societies do not require constant equilibrium. They require recoverable imbalance. Money supports this by allowing systems to drift within tolerable ranges and correct when pressure accumulates. Correction rarely feels elegant. It arrives as friction, as hesitation, as constraint, as slowed movement. People experience it as inconvenience rather than instruction. Money communicates through inconvenience. When exchange becomes harder, people adjust. They reduce exposure. They reconsider commitments. They restore balance through behavior rather than decree. This behavioral correction is gradual. It spreads unevenly. Some adjust early, others later. Money records all of it, compressing diverse responses into overall pattern. This compression can make change appear sudden in retrospect. In reality, it unfolds slowly. Balance is restored not by a single action, but by accumulation of small shifts. Money allows these shifts to coordinate without centralized control. This decentralization is essential. Central control cannot perceive all local conditions. Balance must emerge from distributed sensing. Money provides the medium through which this sensing becomes collective. Yet distributed sensing requires tolerance for error. Some will misjudge. Some will overcorrect. Some will delay. Money accommodates this diversity by averaging outcomes over time. Averages hide extremes. This hiding protects systems from volatility. It also masks individual experience. People may feel strain even when the system appears balanced. Societies respond to this tension through supplemental structures. Support, relief, and adjustment mechanisms arise to address what averages obscure. Money does not replace these mechanisms. It operates alongside them. Its role remains coordination, not care. Balance, not comfort. Continuity, not perfection. Understanding this limitation prevents disappointment. Money cannot guarantee harmony. It can only support manageability. It allows systems to function with an imperfect balance rather than collapse under imbalance. As abstraction increased, balance became a shared responsibility. People learned that their individual actions mattered less in isolation and more in aggregate. This awareness softened personal blame and sharpened collective attention. Yet collective attention is diffuse. It moves slowly. It reacts after patterns form. Money participates in this reaction by adjusting flows in response to use. These adjustments are often mistaken for intent. Money is said to push or pull. In reality, it mirrors. It responds to what people are already doing. Understanding this mirroring reveals money's true character. It is not a force imposing balance. It is a surface reflecting imbalance until correction emerges. From barter, where balance was enforced by scarcity, to coins, where balance followed supply, to records and processes, where balance followed behavior, the evolution has been consistent. Balance moves from sensation to structure. Money adapts by becoming a language for expressing what cannot be felt directly. It does not instruct people to slow down. It makes slowing visible. It does not demand restraint. It records when restraint appears. This recording is enough. Over time, societies learn to live within this feedback loop. They trust it not because it is perfect, but because it is familiar. They accept that imbalance will occur and that correction will follow. This acceptance reduces fear. Fear is strongest when imbalance feels final. Money reduces finality by allowing adjustment. It does not promise safety. It promises continuity through correction. That promise is implicit, not stated. It is reinforced each time systems strain and then stabilize again. As long as this pattern continues, money remains credible. It remains the medium through which balance is lost and regained, not through command, but through participation. And so the movement continues, shaped by how people collectively sense excess and restraint, reflected through exchange, and carried forward by a system that responds to imbalance not with judgment, but with adaptation. Money remains embedded in this process, quiet and persistent, allowing societies to move, stretch, and recover within limits that are no longer felt directly, but are still very real, shaping the rhythm of collective life as it unfolds across time. As this collective sense of balance became familiar, money also began to shape how people experienced rhythm. In early life, rhythm was imposed by the natural world. Light and dark, planting and harvest, rest and labor followed patterns that could not be ignored. Activity rose and fell in response to forces outside human control. As exchange became abstract and continuous, rhythm became less visible. Money allowed activity to extend beyond natural cycles. Work could continue after dark. Exchange could continue across seasons. Effort no longer paused automatically. Rhythm shifted from nature to schedule. This shift was gradual. At first, schedules mirrored natural patterns. Over time, they became independent. Days were divided into units. Weeks repeated predictably. Obligations arrived on set intervals. Money gave these intervals weight. Rhythm became procedural. People learned to live within repeating cycles of obligation rather than responding to environmental cues. Payment dates, settlement periods, and recurring commitments structured time quietly. This structure brought reliability. People could plan. They could anticipate. They could align effort with expectation. Money made coordination across many lives possible by synchronizing rhythm. But synchronization came with cost. When rhythm is imposed by system rather than felt internally, fatigue accumulates quietly. The body may tire before the schedule pauses. Attention may dull before obligation ends. Money does not feel fatigue. It continues to mark time evenly. It treats each interval the same. People must adapt themselves to it rather than the other way around. Societies learned to manage this tension. They created sanctioned pauses. Weekends, holidays, and rituals interrupted routine. These breaks were not economic necessities. They were human ones. Money adapted to these pauses without resisting them. It paused when people paused. It resumed when people returned. This accommodation preserved legitimacy. Over long periods, rhythm became layered. Natural cycles continued beneath procedural ones. Personal rhythms coexisted with institutional schedules. Money interacted mostly with the latter, leaving the former to be managed privately. This layering allowed flexibility. People learned to move between rhythms, to meet obligations while protecting rest, to participate in systems without surrendering entirely to them. This navigation was uneven. Some rhythms aligned well, others conflicted. Money did not resolve these conflicts. It made them visible through strain. Strain appeared as reduced engagement, as mistakes, as withdrawal. Money reflected these signs through slowed participation and altered patterns. Institutions responded gradually. They adjusted schedules. They revised expectations. They formalized pauses. These adjustments were framed as efficiency, but they served sustainability. Money absorbed these changes without complaint. It adjusted to new rhythms as long as they were widely observed. Use determined legitimacy. This adaptability preserved continuity. Rigid rhythm would have exhausted participation. Flexible rhythm allowed renewal. Money survived by aligning with human tolerance rather than enforcing tempo. Rhythm also influenced trust. Predictable cycles reinforced confidence. Irregularity weakened it. People learned to associate reliability with repetition. Money provided that repetition through scheduled exchange. Over time, this repetition became background. People stopped noticing rhythm consciously. They lived within it. Only when it changed did attention return. Change felt disruptive not because it was harmful, but because it broke expectation. Money registered this disruption immediately through altered behavior. This sensitivity allowed correction. Systems adjusted tempo when participation flagged. They slowed where strain appeared. They resumed pace when confidence returned. Money did not decide these adjustments. It mirrored them. This mirroring is consistent across its evolution. Money does not lead rhythm. It follows it. From barter where rhythm followed nature, to coins, where rhythm followed trade routes, to records and processes, where rhythm follows schedules, the progression has been steady. Rhythm moves from external constraint to internal management. Money adapts by becoming a timekeeper rather than a taskmaster. It marks intervals. It does not enforce meaning. People decide how to live within those intervals. As long as people require coordination across time, some shared rhythm is necessary. Money provides that rhythm in a form that can scale, but it remains incomplete. It cannot sense fatigue. It cannot feel rest. It cannot know when renewal is due. These judgments remain human. Societies continue to adjust the relationship between system rhythm and lived rhythm. They negotiate pace through behavior rather than decree. Money carries the outcome of that negotiation forward. This process never settles permanently. Conditions change. Tolerance shifts. New rhythms emerge. Money adapts again. And so episode 3 continues in this exploration of abstraction not as loss, but as relocation. Control relocates. Limits relocate. Balance relocates. Rhythm relocates. Money follows each relocation, not by resisting it, but by absorbing it into structure. It remains a medium through which human life finds coordination without surrendering entirely to uniformity, allowing many rhythms to coexist within a shared frame, enabling societies to move together without demanding that everyone move in the same way or at the same pace at all times. The movement continues, patient and unannounced, shaped by how people live within time, adjust to strain, and seek renewal within systems that mark time evenly while human life moves unevenly beneath them. As this shared rhythm became embedded in daily life, money also began to shape how people understood momentum. In earlier forms of exchange, momentum was fragile. Activity built slowly and faded quickly. A journey began and ended. A market gathered and dispersed. Movement depended on presence. When people stopped, exchange stopped with them. With abstract, system-based money, momentum became sustained. Exchange no longer depended on individual presence. Systems continued to operate even as participants came and went. Value moved while people rested. Obligations progressed while attention shifted elsewhere. Momentum detached from bodies. This detachment changed perception. People began to experience continuity as something external. Activity seemed to carry itself forward. Effort entered a flow that did not pause simply because one person stepped away. This feeling was subtle but powerful. Momentum created expectation. If something had been moving yesterday, it was assumed to move tomorrow. Planning extended naturally. Interruption felt unusual. Money reinforced this assumption by marking continuity through ongoing exchange. As long as transactions cleared and obligations advanced, momentum appeared intact. Yet momentum can mask strain. When activity carries itself forward, exhaustion is harder to notice. Systems continue even when participants tire. People adjust individually, but the overall flow persists. This persistence is both strength and risk. It allows coordination to survive temporary withdrawal. It also delays recognition of collective fatigue. Money reflects momentum faithfully, not discerning whether it is healthy or strained. Signs of strain appear indirectly. Small delays, minor errors, reduced engagement. Money registers these signs as subtle changes in pattern. Slowing circulation, shortened horizons, hesitation at the margins. These signals accumulate. At first, they feel insignificant. Over time, they reshape momentum. What once moved easily now requires effort. Continuity begins to feel heavy. People respond gradually. They conserve energy. They narrow participation. They focus on essentials. Money records this narrowing without judgment. Momentum slows. This slowing is rarely announced. It unfolds quietly as behavior shifts. Systems respond later, adjusting expectations, revising pace, restoring margins. Money absorbs these adjustments by accommodating new patterns of use. This capacity to slow without stopping preserves continuity. Total stoppage would fracture coordination. Gradual slowing allows recovery. Money enables this by allowing partial participation rather than demanding constant engagement. People step back without leaving entirely. This flexibility is essential in large systems. No one can maintain constant intensity. Money allows engagement to fluctuate without collapsing structure. It separates personal energy from systemic momentum. Over time, societies learn to manage this separation. They design systems that can carry forward even as individuals rest. They accept that momentum must sometimes be restrained rather than encouraged. Money reflects these design choices. It flows more slowly when restraint is valued. It accelerates when confidence returns. It mirrors collective tolerance for pace. This mirroring reinforces habit. People come to expect continuity unless disruption is visible. They plan on momentum holding. When it does not, surprise follows. Surprise draws attention. Attention prompts adjustment. Adjustment restores balance. Money carries each stage forward. From barter where momentum depended on presence, to coins, where momentum followed trade routes, to records and processes, where momentum follows systems, the evolution is consistent. Momentum becomes less personal and more structural. Money adapts by becoming a carrier of motion rather than an expression of effort. It moves value through time, even when individual energy ebbs. This ability supports endurance. Endurance matters more than speed. Systems that move too quickly exhaust participation. Systems that can slow survive. Money survives by allowing momentum to be moderated through use rather than command. It does not push people forward. It allows them to continue. This distinction is subtle. Money does not create drive. It preserves direction. It allows activity to resume after pause without starting from nothing. That resumption is key. In complex societies, starting over entirely is costly. Money provides continuity across pauses, allowing life to pick up where it left off. As long as people value continuity, money will remain central to maintaining momentum that can be slowed, redirected, and renewed. It will not insist on constant motion. It will reflect when motion feels possible. And so the movement continues, shaped by how societies carry activity forward without demanding endless energy, reflected through patterns of exchange that slow and quicken with human capacity. Money remains embedded in this process, neither urging speed nor enforcing rest, but quietly enabling momentum to exist without overwhelming those who participate in it, allowing coordination to persist even as individuals move at uneven pace through the shared rhythm of time. As this managed momentum became familiar, money also began to shape how people understood pause. In earlier life, pause was unavoidable. Night stopped work. Weather interrupted travel. Scarcity forced waiting. Pause arrived from outside and could not be negotiated. It was accepted because it was imposed. With abstract systems, pause became optional. Exchange could continue even when individuals stepped back. Systems did not rest unless people collectively chose to slow them. Pause shifted from inevitability to decision. This change altered how people experienced rest. Rest was no longer guaranteed by circumstance. It had to be claimed. Individuals learned to step away while systems continued. Money made this possible by separating personal participation from collective continuity. This separation was protective. People could withdraw without dismantling coordination. They could rest without causing collapse. Money absorbed absence and maintained structure. Yet this protection also created pressure. When systems continue without pause, stepping away can feel like falling behind. Activity carries on. Obligations accumulate. Return requires catching up. Pause becomes costly. Societies learned to manage this tension gradually. They created shared pauses, agreed moments when systems slowed together. These pauses restored balance between motion and rest. Money adapted by respecting them when they were widely observed. This respect was practical. Money follows use. When people pause together, exchange pauses. When people resume, exchange resumes. No enforcement is required. Coordination emerges from behavior. Over time, people became sensitive to the difference between individual pause and collective pause. Individual pause relieved fatigue, but did not reset rhythm. Collective pause restored it. Money reflected this distinction by responding more clearly to shared behavior than to isolated withdrawal. This reflection shaped expectation. People came to understand that rest was most effective when coordinated. Money provided the signal that coordination had occurred by slowing visibly. Visibility mattered. When pause was shared, it felt legitimate. When it was individual, it felt fragile. Money mirrored this legitimacy by adjusting patterns only when participation changed broadly. This dynamic influenced how societies valued rest. Rest was no longer only personal care. It became structural maintenance. Systems required downtime just as bodies did. Money carried this understanding forward by responding to reduced use. As abstraction increased, pause became another rhythm to manage. Not enforced by nature, not guaranteed by structure, but negotiated through collective behavior. Money participated in this negotiation without directing it. It did not declare when to stop. It recorded when people did. This recording was enough. When pause was needed, behavior shifted. Exchange slowed. Money reflected that slowing. Systems adjusted. Recovery followed. This process was rarely smooth. Some resisted pause. Others embraced it early. Money carried all responses forward. Outcomes varied. Experience accumulated. Over time, societies learned to recognize early signs of overload. They adjusted sooner. Pauses became shorter but more frequent. Money adapted to these patterns. Adaptation preserved endurance. Endurance is quieter than intensity. It does not announce itself. It persists. Money favors endurance because it survives through repetition rather than force. From barter, where pause was imposed, to coins, where pause followed travel, to records and processes, where pause follows behavior, the movement has been consistent. Pause moves from outside control to shared choice. Money adapts by becoming sensitive to use rather than enforcing rest. It allows people to pause without stopping everything. It allows systems to slow without breaking. It provides continuity across rest. This continuity reduces fear. People are more willing to pause when they trust that systems will still be there when they return. Money reinforces that trust by holding place through absence. Absence becomes tolerable. Tolerable absence allows renewal. Renewal restores capacity. Capacity sustains participation. Money carries each step forward quietly. As long as people live within systems that move beyond individual presence, they will need ways to step back without dismantling coordination. Money remains one of those ways. It does not grant rest. It makes rest survivable. And in doing so, it allows human life to breathe within structures that would otherwise demand constant motion. The movement continues, shaped by how people learn to pause together, to rest without fear of collapse, and to return to participation when capacity allows. Money remains embedded in this learning, responding to collective rhythms, reflecting shared decisions, and enabling coordination to endure through cycles of motion and pause, again and again, across time. As this shared understanding of pause took hold, money also began to shape how people experienced patience. In early life, patience was enforced. Waiting was unavoidable. Travel took time. Messages moved slowly. Outcomes arrived when they arrived. Patience was not a virtue so much as a condition. With abstract systems, waiting became conditional. Some things still took time, but others moved quickly. Delay was no longer universal. It appeared selectively, depending on process. Money contributed to this selectivity by organizing expectations around schedules rather than uncertainty. People learned to expect timing. Not exact outcomes, but intervals. Something would happen after a known period. This predictability changed how waiting felt. It became tolerable because it was bounded. Bounded waiting reduces anxiety. When people know how long they must wait, patience becomes manageable. Money provided this knowledge through regularity. Dates, cycles, and sequences replaced open-ended delay. Yet bounded waiting also sharpened awareness of delay. When expectations are clear, deviation stands out. Waiting feels heavier when it exceeds what was anticipated. Money made this deviation visible by establishing norms. Norms create contrast. People notice when something is late because they know when it should have arrived. This awareness increases sensitivity. It also increases demand for explanation. Systems respond by refining schedules. They narrow windows. They clarify steps. They communicate timing more precisely. These refinements are aimed not at speed, but at reassurance. Reassurance matters. People do not require instant results. They require confidence that delay has meaning. Money provides that meaning by situating waiting within structure. Waiting becomes part of participation, a step in a process rather than an interruption. People adjust behavior accordingly. They plan around delay rather than resist it. This adjustment is learned. At first, waiting feels passive. Over time, it becomes active. People use waiting periods for other tasks. They distribute attention. Money enables this by making outcomes predictable enough to defer focus. Deferred focus preserves energy. Without it, waiting would consume attention. Money frees attention by assuring that outcomes will arrive when expected, allowing people to turn elsewhere in the meantime. This freedom supports complexity. Large systems require participants to wait often. If waiting demanded constant vigilance, participation would collapse. Money prevents this by allowing waiting to fade into background. Yet background waiting can accumulate. Too many delays, even predictable ones, strain tolerance. People sense congestion. They feel slowed. Money registers this strain through patterns of use. When waiting becomes excessive, participation narrows. People shorten commitments. They seek alternatives. They reduce exposure. Money reflects these changes without commentary. Systems adjust in response. They streamline. They reorganize. They restore margins. These adjustments are aimed at restoring tolerable waiting rather than eliminating it. Elimination is impossible. Some delay is inherent in coordination. Money does not remove it. It makes it legible. Legibility changes experience. People accept delay when they can place it within a sequence. They resist delay when it feels arbitrary. Money provides sequence through process. Process replaces uncertainty with order. Order does not guarantee satisfaction. It guarantees orientation. People know where they are in relation to outcome. This orientation matters more than speed. Without orientation, waiting feels endless. With it, waiting feels finite. Money supplies this orientation by structuring time around obligation and completion. Over long periods, societies refine tolerance for waiting. They learn how much delay can be absorbed without loss of engagement. Money becomes a gauge for this tolerance, reflecting when waiting is acceptable and when it becomes a barrier. This reflection is continuous. It happens quietly through use. No declaration is needed. Patterns shift. Systems respond. Patience in this sense is not moral. It is structural. People are patient when systems make patience workable. Money contributes by aligning expectation with process. When alignment holds, patience follows. When it breaks, frustration appears. Frustration signals need for adjustment. Money carries that signal forward. From barter where waiting was imposed to coins, where waiting followed distance, to records and processes, where waiting follows procedure, the progression is clear. Waiting moves from inevitability to design. Money adapts by becoming a tool for managing expectation rather than enduring uncertainty. It does not teach patience. It creates conditions in which patience is possible. This distinction matters. People do not become more patient because they are instructed to. They become patient when waiting fits within their understanding of time and effort. Money helps create that fit. As long as coordination requires delay, patience will remain part of exchange. Money will continue to shape how it is experienced, not by eliminating waiting, but by making it bearable. And so the movement continues, shaped by how people learn to live with delay that is no longer natural but procedural, no longer imposed but structured. Money remains embedded in this learning, organizing time quietly, aligning expectation with outcome, and allowing patience to exist not as resignation, but as a manageable part of living within systems that move at a pace no single person controls, yet everyone must accommodate. As this procedural patience became part of everyday experience, money also began to shape how people understood anticipation. In earlier life, anticipation was vague. Outcomes depended on weather, distance, and chance. People hoped rather than expected. Preparation was cautious because the future was uncertain. With structured exchange, anticipation became more precise. Money allowed people to imagine future outcomes with greater clarity. Not certainty, but shape. A sequence could be followed. An obligation could be projected. Anticipation became organized rather than open-ended. This organization changed emotional tone. Hope became quieter. Anxiety became more specific. People no longer worried about everything at once. They worried about particular moments. Deadlines replaced uncertainty. Money contributed to this narrowing. By linking effort to future settlement, it gave anticipation boundaries. People could see where preparation ended and waiting began. This reduced diffuse fear. Boundaries mattered. Without them, anticipation overwhelms attention. With them, it becomes manageable. Money provided those boundaries through structure. Yet structured anticipation also intensified focus. When the future is clearly outlined, deviations feel sharper. Small changes draw attention. Disruption stands out against expectation. Money sharpened this contrast by establishing norms. Norms guide behavior. They tell people what to expect and when. Anticipation aligns with these expectations. When alignment holds, confidence follows. When it breaks, unease appears. Money registers this unease through behavior. People delay. They hesitate. They shorten plans. These adjustments reflect uncertainty about anticipated outcomes. Money records these shifts as changes in pattern. Anticipation softens. People move from projection to caution. They prepare less far ahead. They narrow horizons. Money adapts by reflecting shorter cycles of engagement. This adaptability is essential. If anticipation were rigid, systems would fracture under uncertainty. Money survives by allowing anticipation to contract and expand with confidence. Expansion and contraction form another rhythm. Periods of long planning alternate with periods of short focus. Money carries both without resistance. It does not prefer optimism or caution. It reflects whichever is present. Over time, societies become skilled at living with this fluctuation. They accept that anticipation will never be stable. It responds to experience. Money becomes a medium through which that response is expressed. This expression is subtle. Anticipation does not announce itself. It appears in how far ahead people are willing to commit, in how much uncertainty they tolerate, in how flexible their plans become. Money translates these choices into structure. Long commitments indicate confidence. Short commitments indicate caution. Money aggregates these signals into overall direction. Direction emerges gradually. No single decision defines it. It forms through accumulation. Money records this accumulation patiently. Patience remains central. Anticipation without patience collapses into urgency. Money tempers urgency by distributing outcomes across time. It allows anticipation to exist without demanding immediate resolution. This distribution supports stability. People can live with uncertainty when it is spaced. Money spaces uncertainty by embedding it in process. One step follows another. Each step narrows uncertainty slightly. This narrowing is comforting. It allows people to move forward without knowing everything at once. Money enables this by linking effort to incremental outcome rather than final result. Incremental outcome reduces risk. It allows adjustment. If something changes, plans can be revised. Money supports revision by allowing commitments to be broken into parts. Parts are easier to manage than wholes. This modularity is a key feature of abstract exchange. It allows anticipation to be flexible. People can prepare without locking themselves entirely into a single future. Money encourages this flexibility by rewarding partial participation. You do not need to commit everything at once. You can proceed step by step. This approach lowers the emotional cost of anticipation. Lower cost increases participation. People are more willing to engage when anticipation feels manageable. Money supports this willingness by structuring the future into approachable segments. Yet segmentation can also fragment attention. People focus on the next step rather than the whole. Long-term meaning can fade. Societies counter this by maintaining narratives that extend beyond immediate settlement. Money does not provide narrative. It provides sequence. Narrative remains human work. Together, sequence and narrative allow anticipation to exist without becoming either reckless or paralyzing. Money supplies the sequence. Culture supplies the story. As long as both are present, anticipation remains balanced. From barter, where anticipation was shaped by uncertainty, to coins, where anticipation followed distance, to records and processes, where anticipation follows structure, the progression is clear. Anticipation becomes more defined, but never complete. Money adapts by becoming a tool for living with partial knowledge. It does not remove uncertainty. It organizes it. This organization allows people to act, prepare, and wait without demanding full foresight. It allows anticipation to remain present without overwhelming attention. And so the movement continues, shaped by how people imagine the future in bounded ways, how they prepare without certainty, and how they adjust expectation as experience unfolds. Money remains embedded in this process, quietly structuring anticipation, translating confidence and caution into rhythm, and allowing life to proceed step by step into a future that is never fully known, but is made approachable through the steady, patient unfolding of exchange. As this long movement settles, it does not arrive at a final point. Money does not complete a journey. It maintains one. From the earliest exchanges shaped by memory and presence, to coins held for trust, to paper accepted for promise, and onward into systems built on process, rhythm, and expectation, money has continually shifted where certainty lives. Not to remove uncertainty, but to make it livable. What began as direct exchange slowly became coordination across distance, time, and anonymity. Along the way, responsibility moved into systems. Memory moved into records. Limits moved into structure. Rhythm moved into schedules. Anticipation moved into process. At each stage, something was gained and something was relocated. Nothing was ever fully resolved. Money endured not because it answered human needs completely, but because it allowed them to coexist. Trust without intimacy, cooperation without familiarity, continuity without constant awareness. It learned quietly to stay incomplete. That incompleteness is what allows human life to remain larger than exchange. Meaning, care, identity, and judgment were never absorbed fully. They remained elsewhere, shaping how money is used rather than being defined by it. So the movement continues, not toward perfection, not toward final balance, but toward ongoing adjustment. Ordinary actions repeated, small choices accumulating, confidence expanding and contracting, systems tightening and loosening. All of it carried forward through exchange that is rarely noticed, but always present. Money remains part of the background of human life, not as a guide, not as a promise, but as a structure that responds to how people live together over long periods of time. If you found value in this calm, reflective exploration, you can support this series by liking the episode, subscribing, and continuing with the next chapter as this long history unfolds further.